All right, hello folks. Welcome to the first video lecture of this section of your post-1865 American Literature Survey course. So our course starts in 1865, which is of course the end of the US Civil War. And so the first lecture in the series for our class is going to be on two iconic American poets, Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and their significance within the American literary canon and American literary history. So, um, we have to start with thinking about the periodization of American literature. And so, just so you understand, periodization, that word that you see in the title of this slide, that word has to do with um, breaking up of some kind of timeline into discrete periods. So this is the pre-Civil War period, and this is the post-Civil War period. American literature tends to almost uniformly at every university in the country get periodized at 1865. So there is U.S. literature up through the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, there's something else. And that's somewhat arbitrary, and it's somewhat not. There's actually a lot of rich scholarly debate amongst American literature specialists about whether this is a good idea or not. But it is how we do things in a lot of our classes. So one of the one of the things that we have to start our class understanding is how that periodization is significant. And so first thing to understand is just how substantial of a place in U.S. history the U.S. Civil War has, which may be differently salient in different parts of the country, right? Um, but it is significant to just understand that the Civil War was indeed fought over the question of slavery. So you might have heard folks say, well, it was really about states' rights, it was really about any number of other things. But when you ask someone states' rights to do what, the answer to that question is to legalize slavery, right? And so up until 1861, the United States have been involved. The United States politics have been involved in a lot of debates over whether slavery should remain legal, should remain only legal in certain areas and not others. Whether there's a distinction between whether the trade itself should be legal or illegal versus the actual status of holding enslaved people as property. A whole lot of questions. And in 1861, of course, South Carolina is the first state, and then a whole bunch of states secede from the United States and create the Confederacy. That war lasts for 4 years. Uh, Over 500,000 U.S. Americans die in that war. Um, and During that war, the Emancipation Proclamation is passed by President Lincoln, um, who then, only a few days after that, also orders the greatest mass execution in the history of the United States by ordering the execution of 31 Dakota indigenous warriors for their resistance to U.S. imperialism. So Abraham Lincoln gets to neither be the good guy or the bad guy. But the Emancipation Proclamation passes. Slavery is officially legally abolished at the end of the Civil War. And that inaugurates a brand new era in the history of the United States. What does that have to do with an American literature class, though? Well, the middle of the 19th century is really significant for American literary history because in early American history, a lot of the ways that folks, even in the United States, would think and talk about literature in America was that American authors were often just copying European authors, right? That American poetry was just an imitation of English, French, Spanish, other poetry from Europe. Um, there was no good American novel. Um, American stage plays were seen as lesser than British stage plays, right? There was no American Shakespeare. There was this idea that there wasn't really yet an American literature. Um, and so the Civil War happens, and after the Civil War, a really significant poet, Walt Whitman, um, he sees, and he's not alone in thinking this, he sees the end of the Civil War as an affirmation of the correctness, the moral rightness of American democracy itself. Because the North won the war, and by winning the war, reunited all of the different states into one country, Whitman and others saw that as a confirmation of the the righteousness of the American project, of the fact that America could make itself better. And so, following the Civil War, Walt Whitman, who himself was an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery, but he was also racist against black people. So Whitman himself is another complicated figure, and that's actually a very common personal view in the 19th century among some white Americans to be anti-slavery, to think slavery is wrong, but to also be racist and think that black people are less than white people. Whitman was one of these folks. Um, so he is happy that the Civil War ends and that slavery is abolished, but he's even happier that the result of the Civil War is a united country. And he sees this as a confirmation of democracy. And so he says in this very long essay called Democratic Vistas, following the Civil War, that now that American democracy has been confirmed, there can emerge a true American literature. Um, and so part of that was Whitman's own ambitiousness, which I'll talk about during this lecture. He so very much saw himself as the writer of American literature, right? He had a very large sense of self. He was a very confident individual. Um, uh, but history would prove him somewhat correct in that a lot of literary historians, as in folks who tell the history of literature about America, would point to the mid 19th century as as a point of emergence of what we might call a distinctly American literature that differentiates itself from European forms. And the two poets that American literary historians will tell you are the kind of signature writers of this moment are Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So Whitman and Dickinson are very different people, very different writers. The one thing they have in common, I guess the couple things they have in common is they're both white and they're both Northerners. Um, but Whitman is born 11 years earlier than Dickinson and also lives longer than her. Walt Whitman is a very self-consciously public figure. Whitman actively wanted to be famous, right? He self-published his first editions of his book of poetry. He may or may not have enhanced that picture of him that you see there, which appears on the front page um, of his first edition of Leaves of Grass, his book of poetry. He may or may not have enhanced that photo to make himself seem more robust and attractive. He very much he saw himself as a great writer, wasn't getting the recognition that like he should have. He went out of his way to try to make his writing known. But he was also a public servant, right? So Whitman had this kind of large ego, but he was also a public servant. He worked as a nurse, for example, during the U.S. Civil War, took care of literally hundreds of wounded and sick soldiers during the war, and did so without pay. So he was also a public servant. He was a journalist. He did a lot, but basically, this idea of self-conscious public figure is he saw himself as writing for an American public, right? He wasn't just writing for himself. He also had very limited formal education, right? He's not a hyper educated individual, but he was hyper mobile. He traveled all around the country. Um, he was from New York. Spent a lot of time in Brooklyn, Long Island, in Manhattan. Has poems about New York, but he traveled, especially because of his work during the Civil War. Um, Whitman is also widely acknowledged as a queer writer. He wrote explicitly in his poems about love and sexual intimacy between men. He very famously has a cluster of over 40 poems. It's called the Calamus Cluster, where every single poem is about male love. Um, uh, so it is pretty impossible to read Whitman's poetry and not understand that he was a queer person before we have the language of queerness, right? Um, in a way where some writers, but you think of like, or you heard in high school that like queer writers would like have to say it in code, or they'd have to like make it symbolism or like change the pronouns. Whitman did not talk in code. Whitman very explicitly was writing about men loving men. Um, uh, so he's widely acknowledged as a queer writer, now at least. Um, Interestingly, Whitman is one of the most canonical American poets, but he wasn't canonized as a writer until after his death. During his lifetime, he was known, people knew who he was, but a lot of people were grossed out by how sensual and physical his poetry was. People didn't really get his poetic form, which I'll talk about in a second. And so he had a more limited kind of, if you want to say, fandom during his lifetime and became really canonized later after he died, especially as minoritized American writers really saw his democratic project. I might not talk a lot about this during the lecture, but Whitman has a lot of problematic things about him. But he's also at the same time someone who deeply believes in egalitarian democracy, even though he has a lot of moments of contradiction where his vision of egalitarianism rubs up against his unacknowledged racism and imperialism. But those moments of egalitarian democracy in his poetry inspired a lot of Black poets and a lot of queer poets in the 20th century. But that's another lecture for another time. In contrast to Whitman, you can see how I've lined up these bullet points on the slide. Dickinson was a very self-consciously private individual. She was not interested in being famous. In fact, she never wanted to publish her poems. She wrote her poems and kept them herself, bounded them together in her own books, and they weren't published until after her death by members of her family. And so there's a slight like ethical question when we study Emily Dickinson, when we think about like she's this amazing poet and the world is made richer by her poetry. But if she were to have her own choice, she never really wanted her poems to be published. They're only published because her family published them after she died. So that's just a thing to keep in mind. In contrast to the big ego of Whitman, Dickinson was content to write her poems um, and wasn't really looking to be famous. Unlike Whitman, she did have a strong formal education. She went to Mount Holyoke College. She studied the liberal arts. She was very, very knowledgeable of many different subjects. Um, uh, so she's someone who has a vast knowledge base to draw on as she's imagining the world of her poetry. Um, and like Whitman, she's also a queer writer, but unlike Whitman, um, her queerness is still very controversial to a lot of people. A lot of people still don't want to acknowledge the fact that the evidence we have from her private letters so strongly suggests that she was in love with at least one woman, if not in general, someone who loved women. Um, her best friend and eventual sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. Um, uh, that um, that some people, because her poems aren't as on the surface explicit as Whitman's, just don't want to accept this evidence that we have of Dickinson's queerness. And so a lot of especially more recent scholars, scholars of my generation, would pretty nonchalantly like acknowledge both Whitman and Dickinson as queer poets. Um, Earlier generations of scholars would accept Whitman as queer way before they would accept Dickinson as queer. So I want to do my due diligence of letting you know that. Besides their biographies, we also have to think about their poetics, meaning their actual style. And in this class, it's always really important to remember that the style and aesthetics and form of a piece of literature are all just as important as the content. And so I've laid out some comparisons of Whitman and Dickinson's styles. Whitman and Dickinson both draw on the lyric tradition, which is defined in your reading for today, but you can think of lyric poems as poems that are about an individual subject's immediate feelings, right? An individual subject or an I, like you see there, the lyric an I has a spontaneous or deep feeling that's being expressed. That would be lyric poetry. Both Dickinson and Whitman write lyric poems. Whitman, however, also draws on the tradition of epic poetry in the kind of length and grandiosity of what he writes. His most famous poem is, of course, Song of Myself, some editions of which will run over 60, 70 pages long, one poem. Dickinson, in contrast, is extremely concise. Her poems are very short to the point. You can think of Whitman as big gestures, really making a big poem, and Dickinson trying to find that perfect distillation of feeling in language, right? Thinking of Dickinson as like always economical, and Whitman as always extra expressive. Um, that said, Whitman also has some very short poems too, but in general, that's a kind of a broad brushstrokes comparison. Um, Whitman's poetry is the catalog, which refers to the fact that Whitman, in a lot of his poems, will have what sounds like lists, where he'll talk about like the soldiers and the workers and the teachers and he'll start listing occupations. He has it's a poetic technique called catalog, where you put things, where you group things into sets within your poetry. He's big on that. Anaphora is just a fancy word for repetition or repeated phrases. Whitman really likes to get a momentum going by using anaphora. And Whitman also uses very musical rhythms sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. Um, Dickinson has very deliberate pacing in her poems. So she's very concise and she's very deliberate. You can think of Dickinson as that artist who has a vision and is going to really craft and make it like a small, tightly composed vision. Whitman is also someone who has a huge vision. Whitman actually spends his entire life working on only one book of poetry, Leaves of Grass. And he adds and takes away and revises it throughout his entire life. So I don't want you to think that Whitman was just this erratic writer who did whatever he wanted and never went back to edit, and Dickinson was this meticulous editor. But instead, think of it as their versions of being deliberate were very different, right? So for Dickinson, it's a deliberate pacing. And you can see this. Dickinson is very famous for her use of dashes. She uses dashes a lot and really expertly in ways that are really interesting to a lot of poets. And the two poetry terms that you want to know for Dickinson are caesura, which means a pause that is inserted into a poetic line, sometimes by a dash, sometimes by extra space, sometimes by a comma, or sometimes by the second word, enjambment. Enjambment refers to a line break. Where does a line stop so that another line can start? Knowing that, of course, there's no such thing as sentences in poems, there are lines. And sometimes you can see that maybe something you might think of as a sentence is broken up across two or even more different lines. So enjambment is where a line ends and gets cut off. And so enjambment is a way to use caesura, which is pausing in poetry. And Dickinson uses caesura and enjambment very deliberately to get pacing in her poetry. Both poets are really interested in the fact that both the body and the soul matter to them. Whitman is When Whitman thinks about the soul, he's not really thinking religiously like Christianity. He's thinking more kind of like transcendentally about the soul. But it's very important to Whitman that the body and the soul are equals. Whereas a lot of Christian influenced American poetry before the mid 19th century elevated the soul above the body and talked about the body as this dirty thing and the soul as this beautiful, clean thing. Whitman is explicitly giving a middle finger to that tradition and saying, no, the body is secret, just like the soul is. Um, Dickinson is less interested in giving a middle finger and more interested in saying, like, yes, Dickinson is more Christian, and yes, the soul is this beautiful thing, but our bodies also matter to us. And while her version of eroticism is a lot less explicit than Whitman's, she does actually mix in bodily eroticism with religion, right? Whitman, soul and body, where soul is not religious. Dickinson, soul is sometimes religious and sometimes not, but also has that mixture. Um, and yeah, Whitman has this raw, obvious sensuality, whereas Dickinson has imagistic sensuality, meaning things like an image of a bird drinking nectar might be a hint that something sensual is going on. Whereas Whitman will tell you, like, I lay my head in my comrade's lap. Like, I'm literally putting my head in another man's lap, right? Like, very different ways of being sensual. And then finally, Walt Whitman has very irregular rhyme and meter. Some of Whitman's poems, some, not, I'd say a minority of Whitman's poems, have a discernible, identifiable rhyme scheme and regular meter. Most of Whitman's poetry does not. In contrast, Dickinson is Again, very deliberate in how she plays with rhyme, rhythm, and half rhyme. Half rhyme is when a word, two words almost rhyme, but like that, like maybe one syllable is off, right? Like sure and shoe, right? Um, so both of them have different approaches to rhythm and rhyme. Um, and those two different um, laying out of their styles is really important to think about. So for the rest of this lecture, I'm literally just going to read some poems out loud because I think one of the points I want you to take away from this is that poetry has to be listened to as much as it needs to be read with our eyes. So when you're reading poetry, I do want you to read out loud, and I want you to hear me read some poetry out loud so you can kind of hear someone who has read poems a lot, or at least these poets a lot, so what they sound like. Okay. So this is a very short poem by Walt Whitman from his section of poems called Drum Taps, which are about the Civil War. It's called Reconciliation. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly softly wash, again and ever again this soiled world, for my enemy is dead. A man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white faced and still in the coffin. I draw near, bend down and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin. And here you can see Whitman's feelings about the Civil War. For him, both the Northern soldier and the Southern soldier, who are enemies, are defined as each other. So he's very, very much saying um, that he's very much leaning into this idea of reconciliation. Even though this was a war where one side was fighting to preserve slavery, he's very much wants reconciliation between the two sides to happen. Um, and it's significant when it said when the poet says, "My light touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin." That is something that Whitman did in his life. He did lay his lips upon dead soldiers. He was a nurse. And then one of Whitman's most famous poems, "Oh Captain, My Captain." This is about the death of Abraham Lincoln. And here, in contrast to that last poem, which you probably didn't hear a regular rhyme scheme or a regular rhythm, this one is very much in, has the rhythm of a song. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh, heart, 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 oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Oh, Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up for you, the flag is flung for you, the bugle trills. For you, bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you, the tours are crowding. For you, they call the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, his voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the vector ship comes in with object one. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. I wanted you to hear, I've read that poem many, many times, so I wanted you to kind of hear it with that song rhythm. And then some Dickinson poems. These are much, much shorter, right? I'm going to make this so you can see. So the one on the left first, "I'm nobody, who are you?" And you can almost hear Dickinson delivering this poem to Walt Whitman. "I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a fraud, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bond." On the right, this is another contrast with Whitman, where Whitman was very much always earnest. Dickinson says, "You should tell the truth, but tell it slant. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, every man be blind. And then here are the last two poems. Um, both of these are poems that I would say start to hint at some of the queer content themes in Dickinson's poetry. So first on the left, wild nights, wild nights. Wild nights, were I with thee. Wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. And then on the right, all the letters I could write. Remember what I said about imagistic sensuality. All the letters I could write were not fair as this. Syllables of velvet, sentences of plush, depths of ruby undrained, hid lip for thee, if they it were a hummingbird and sipped just me. Okay, so key takeaways from this lecture. Oh, sorry about that. Key takeaways from this lecture as I get back to that last slide for y'all. The Civil War was central to the formation of American literature, both because of its historical importance with the abolition of slavery, and also because of the way that an emergent American literature came about as the United States reformed itself. Um, Remember that form and content both matter when reading poetry. So when you're talking about poetry, yes, talk about what the words mean, but also talk about what you hear and what you feel. What is the rhythm feel like? What sounds do you notice repeating? What is there a rhythm? Does it remind you of a song? Is there a rhyme scheme? Really getting at like what is the craft of this poem, not just what do the words literally mean. Um, and then a question for you to think about at the end of this lecture, and you can write a response to this. How did two queer poets become the quintessential foundational American poets? Right? And you can maybe reformulate that question for yourself, right? Like, um, what does it mean to you as a student to think that these two poets that nobody would argue truly are the foundational American poets were both queer? And they're super canonical, and no one would argue about how great they were at poetry or how important they are. But people want to argue about their queerness and whether that matters or not, and whether Dickinson even was, or whether we should use that label. And there's still this controversy over issues of identity and representation. And what does it mean that these two foundational poets were queer poets? There's not a right answer to that. There's only what you think. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for sticking through this first video lecture of the semester.